All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining our reunion event this evening, the Class of 1991's Moving the Needle on Climate, Empowering Leadership and Action event. We are delighted to have everyone here this evening. I would like to introduce and start our event off with introducing our panelists. So I'll turn it over to you, Angela Eaton, if you'd like to get started. Just a really quick housekeeping rule. If all of our guests could, if they're able to add their pronouns, their preferred pronouns to their name here in Zoom, that would be lovely. We will be opening up to some Q&A from the audience in a little bit. And so we welcome any questions that you have throughout the portion of our conversation this evening. You can submit those just at the bottom through the Q&A feature. Again, we welcome everyone to add their preferred pronouns to their name here in Zoom. And I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Angela.
Hi, thanks everyone for coming. My name's Angela Eaton, and I am coming to you from San Francisco, the original territory of the Ramaytush and Ohlone peoples. Want to acknowledge before we begin that today is a pretty difficult and eventful day for much of the United States, and it being the anniversary death of George Floyd, and that there's a lot of charge around that, and we want to respect and honor that. Also recognize that there's a lot of energy being put into the civil rights efforts post the Floyd murder. But that's not what we're talking about today. Today we are talking about environment and climate, although there is a through line that we will maybe venture into. I am a director at Safecast. I support community affairs and people doing both air quality and radiation monitoring at Safecast as community efforts. I'm also director at the Open Environmental Data Project, looking at how government can be more accessible with its own public data and how they can incorporate data from others, from communities within their data sets. I'm really looking at environmental data as a public contribution and a public good, an infrastructure that needs to be built, creating cohesion within communities and between communities and other sectors, government, academia, and commercial. I believe that there's a needed data infrastructure that has to be supported through open data. Otherwise, data is oftentimes siloed. We can talk about that if that comes up. And I also look at environmental data as preserving knowledge, deep knowledge that communities might have that extend back centuries and could be about how people view themselves, giving voice to themselves. I am looking at working with government, commercial entities, and academia, and I think that's it on data, environmental data. I'll pass it over to Kif, and
thank you so much, Angela, and thank you for that introduction. And definitely, we're all here quite mindful and humble in the face of the work that's been going on around the country over the last year, and the real pain that many people are feeling while also trying to make this a better place. And I think that's what a lot of our conversation will hopefully be about, thinking about how we address the challenges in front of us. I'm a director at California Volunteers, which is in the office of the governor. I've only been here for a short time, but my job is to lead up a new initiative started by Gavin Newsom called the California Climate Action Corps, which is really trying to, at a larger scale than ever before, mobilize service and volunteerism as tools in addressing climate change. There's been a lot of work for many years around climate in California. Certainly there's technology, there's policy. There have been a number of movements in the service world in this area. This is the first time a state has really tried to lean in and leverage it as a part of their toolbox alongside the policy and technology frame. And I've got the good fortune of helping lead this program. We're in a pilot phase right now. We have about 62 AmeriCorps members in the field serving on community climate organizing projects. We're in the process of identifying and placing 230 people this summer. We'll have another 60 or so in the fall. And budget willing, we may have a lot more positions in this space to support. And as some of you may have seen, there is a civilian climate corps proposal out right now in the Biden administration that would take this even larger. And so I'm really here because I have about a decade of experience in the climate world and increasingly have seen the value and the opportunity of bringing people power to the table as part of the solution, especially at a community level. And so the opportunity to leverage community empowered mobilization to build civic infrastructure to support the very hard work that needs to happen on a technology basis, on a infrastructure basis, is really what the role that I'm trying to serve, and one that I'm excited to talk with my colleagues here about. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mala.
Thank you, Kif and Angela. So I can't think of a better time to have this conversation, certainly given what my colleagues have said about the sad, 1-year anniversary of Mr. Floyd's murder. But we're talking about, how to improve community, how to address some of the inequities in our society. And my name is Malo Hudson. I'm a professor in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. I also direct the Urban Community and Health Equity Lab, which is really focused on doing work at the intersection of urban planning and health equity. So much of my work is in the area of food systems. So I'm doing work across the state of California and thinking about from, how we grow our food, how we transport it, and the impact, especially within schools, primarily in urban areas, but also touching on some of the rural areas, not only in California, but upcoming in Virginia with the project. Another big strand of my work is really around disaster management and recovery. So we know that we've seen the increased intensity of storms and wildfires, certainly looking at Australia, California, Greece, and many other places around the world. So I'm quite interested in the vulnerable populations that are impacted by climate change and what happens as they try to rebuild, and how do we really design cities in our urban areas to be focused, to be more climate resilient. So that's a big part of my work. And I also am quite interested in community development, health equity, and the circular economy. And so how do we create more comprehensive systems that engage community residents to try to address some of these issues? So for example, in New York City, I'm quite interested in the ways that we might be able to take some of our older buildings and retrofit them so that they are much more using healthier materials that benefit residents in a much better way. And so these are the kind of things I'm quite interested in. The built environment's a big part of that. So that ties obviously to infrastructure, wastewater treatment facilities, and things like that. I've also had the fortune lately to be working as a faculty affiliate of the Earth Institute, which soon will become the Columbia Climate School. And through that, I've been working with colleagues thinking about the broader impacts of climate change on our urban areas, not only domestically, but internationally. So from things all the way from coastal viability to thinking about, as I mentioned earlier, food systems, environmental justice, all the way to carbon capture. And so I look forward to having a conversation today. Now, with that said, since I was the last speaker, I want to start off by asking a question of my colleague Kif to kick us off. So Kif, we know what's happening now with the new administration, with a big focus on addressing climate change, and some of your work is certainly focused, around volunteerism. And so one of the questions I want to ask you is, as we think about the potential for a climate service program that might be coming from the federal government, how might the Civilian Climate Corps that you've been working on help communities to respond to the issues around climate change? So if you can just kick us off with that, thinking about it from that perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's a great question. We don't know exactly what they're cooking up over in DC right now. We know there's a lot of conversations happening among a lot of agencies. Sort of the sausage making is happening on a policy side. We've seen some proposals from Senator Coons, from AOC and Senator Markey on what they'd like to see in a service program. And they range quite wildly from, kind of more bare bones to a sort of incredibly robust program at a very large scale. I think what's common from our experience and what we're seeing in some of these proposals, that at least as I read them, is that service programs like this can be incredibly powerful, but they're not the only tool. So we need to think about them as levers of change, as catalyzers, as community mobilizers, not as the end game themselves, right? It's not about how many trees you put in the ground or how many pounds of food can be diverted from the landfill. It's about what happens in communities when these service members are there, both for them, because this is going to be a generational change and opportunity for people to be involved, to learn how to make a difference in their communities, and for the community partners that host and support these, and the many people we hope have a touch point to these individuals. Back when the original CCC happened, it was like, you know, dinners around the table of people hosting these CCC members were some of the bigger lasting impacts. Of course, the number of public works projects that were done was important, but what's really important is the story, the lasting legacy. And it also represents an opportunity for me to cross some divides politically. People love to get out and do stuff in their community, and red, blue, or otherwise, it's amazing. So we were at an event in Fresno recently. Recently elected mayor of Fresno is, you know, a 20-year police veteran. He's out there planting a tree with a community-based environmental justice organization talking about climate. And they're able to see that ground together. The Sierra Club has been definitely critical of our administration's policies and practices, but they're excited to come together around service. So I see this civilian climate corps as having all of that potential, but that's a design problem, right? So how do you actually develop a program at scale that can deliver results? Some of the things we think about is you've got to actually bake in the community focus, right? Otherwise, it could be top down, and it could be a bunch of people doing Forest Service projects, which, as good as they are, they're not going to leave as lasting impact. So it's got to be rooted in community. It's got to tie to our jobs vision for a clean economy. So these can't be just one-off jobs that end up with these people kind of wondering what's next. They should be tied in with labor. They should be tied in, they should be paid with a reasonable wage so that they can actually serve fully in the time they're serving. Should be open to our undocumented citizens, right? We want to have entry points for many, many people. And then, you know, it's got to tie into a movement ideology in the sense that the branding, the cohesion, and the storytelling that are happening by the service members is brought together and brought forward. And I guess the last thing I'll say is there's a lot of resources out there, community organizations doing this work, California, anywhere you look, there's conservation corps that have existed for decades. So we got to leverage those assets and not try and greenfield this whole program. If we do all those things, I think we can have an amazing outcome for the country as a whole.
Thank you. I have so many follow-up questions, so we'll come back around.
Absolutely. And you know, one of the things that dogs me in this work is like, how do we know what we're doing is what communities need? How do we actually tie it into the larger climate impacts? And that's when I turn to Angela and see, like, can we talk a little bit about what community-centric data is? How do we actually empower community members to access, own, and tell their own data-rich stories? Because this is technical work at the end of the day, right? We're talking about greenhouse gas reductions, we're talking about climate resiliency, but we can't just do it from NOAA on down. We've got to actually let communities own some of this process. So Angela, how do we do a better job of bringing community members into that data dialogue?
Well, I think one of the interesting things you're talking about volunteering, and I think one of the ways that I've been really involved in the volunteer effort, or I've seen people really want to come together on it, is volunteering through data collection. And I think that's really interesting because what data does is it can tell a story, it can give voice. So I like to think of data that's community collected, that is collected with the community, by the community, and for the community's purposes, as data as a microphone rather than as a microscope, data collected on a community or data collected from some commercial entity that we are all kind of awash in. So I think that there's a real difference in how people approach the volunteer effort that they're working on in terms of data collection. I think one of your comments really is about, you know, how do we get that technical capability, and or you know, how do we grow that technical capability as part of what people can do in their volunteer efforts towards a better environment. And I think that, like, looking at it as not just something that people are doing for the sake of doing it, or for a project that somebody else is controlling, but doing it for their own good, and then having a reason to do that. Like there's you know, at the end of it, they're doing something with that data that actually helps them organize, creates more community cohesion, and helps them actually discuss matters at hand, policy decisions, land use issues with the government, or with, you know, the kind of being at the table with commercial entities or industry, or even utilities. So I think that seeing community data as part of that, and writing it into how we do our greater volunteer efforts for environmental volunteering is that direct connection that I would like to make. So Kif, did that work? Did that answer? So I think that one of the things that data can do is, like I said, it can give voice, and I'm looking at data equity as part of that voice, and environmental equity and environmental data equity as being all kind of wrapped into one big ball. And Malo, I know that you're working quite a bit on that, and specifically you're looking at gentrification and health equity too. So do you find that people are mostly engaged for health reasons, or are, like, in what ways are you seeing people engage in climate and environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, obviously given this past year, there's been so much focus on COVID-19 and people being at home, and sort of being much more conscious of some of the impacts of our environment and certainly our health. But overall, I would say over the last few years, you've seen a convergence, if you will, of people being very concerned about the built environment and being concerned also about their health, and how those two things interact within their day-to-day lives. And so much of the work I've been doing is working with community residents to talk about the changes that are happening. So in the case of New York City, for example, as I mentioned, my interest in working with residents in public housing or more affordable types of housing developments, they were impacted by Superstorm Sandy. So they know that climate change is real and the impacts of climate change, but also more importantly, how do they deal with some of the issues around infrastructure? So we're thinking about the subway system, or we're just thinking about, building up sea level walls or seawalls to address the rise in sea level, along the coastline. These are all important things for people. And also people are become much more conscious of our food system. Still a lot of work to be done, but having a lot more conversations about where does our food come from? Does it have pesticides on them, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of conversation that's beginning to happen, but still for much of the work that I do and people's concerns, when we talk about health equity, they're talking about really their quality of life. Are they doubled and tripled up in their homes? Do they have houses without lead, homes without lead paint? That sort of thing. Is it affordable? And, and tied to much of this is also the issues around stress, right? So being worried about paying your bills, being worried about, certainly during COVID-19, we think about issues around gender equity, women working, and also oftentimes being the primary caregivers within the home. So all of these are quite important, and people understand the importance of their environment. And so from that, I think people are making the broader connections, certainly within the urban context. And then if you look at people living in rural areas, some of the communities, I'm starting to look at some communities in Virginia as well as in California that have been, and my work in Chile actually is much more in the rural area, about 3 hours south of Santiago. Those areas have been impacted by wildfires, right? And other types of issues around water and so forth. And so they're very conscious of these changes and how it might impact their day-to-day life. Well, they actually have to migrate somewhere else because of the climate's changing so much. So there's a lot of work to be done, but I do think that trying to engage at the local level, like I certainly, the work that you and Kif are doing is incredibly important and definitely ties in to the work I'm trying to do. But certainly I see residents this need for thinking about how they can collect the data, use the data to influence policy. And then, Kit, from your work, I see the need for residents to really think about how do we get engaged? How do we build this momentum within our local area to address some of these issues?
Yeah, and if I can, I'll steal my own next question back
Yes.
because I want to pick up on something that a thread that you both brought in. So we're hearing more and more people talk about resilience, right? Resilience is kind of the new word that a lot of folks use around climate because it encompasses the whole community. It encompasses a lot more issues of public health and equity. Our ability to, our adaptive capacity is becoming an increasingly important topic that allows us to work in this critical juncture between infrastructure, human capacity, health, well-being, mental health is an increasingly important part of the climate change discussion. And something we're kind of grappling with and thinking about is how do you operationalize that? So one of the reasons I'm excited about the work I do, and I think there's potential, is because changing building infrastructure takes decades, right? Actually fixing lead paint, fixing leaky houses, creating a heat island, that is going to take a long time. But you can move community capacity and power more quickly, or it can be the death knell of change mechanisms if you don't have that capacity. So when you were talking about Sandy, I just was reading a story about post-Katrina and the impacts on Baton Rouge, which was never the kind of big hot spot, but saw this massive in-migration and massive impacts. The school districts got like 10,000 extra kids. When people relocate, when people are impacted in their communities, when their communities are fragmented, their ability to be resilient in the face of these changes plummets, their health outcomes plummet, their ability to leverage their community networks to endure these ongoing stresses and shocks plummet. And so how do we factor that into our planning in a macro way, in an infrastructure way? And that's kind of one of the areas we're talking about. California is going through a process of developing its next set of indicators for climate change, and particularly around adaptation. And I'm just raising the question because I don't have a good answer. Where does civic engagement and social cohesion fit into those indicators? Because one, it's going to tell us where not only do we have physical gaps and risks and threats, but where we have human gaps and threats and risks. But also there may be communities that are facing physical risks that actually have a better civic infrastructure that one could lean on or replicate. And so I'm thinking about those aspects across both of your domains as a powerful piece of how we actually move the needle, which is what we came together to talk about. So with my own,
one of the things I think,
Angela's go.
yeah, so Kif, I think it's really interesting. I mean, right now we're talking about cohesion and building cohesion and volunteerism. And I think that doing any kind of work in your community makes you more community minded. Anytime you're participating, you are creating some kind of infrastructure, right? Even if it feels like a day participation or a momentary kind of like dip in and dip out. Now, the program, Kif, that you're running or that you're you're helping to run is a real statewide effort that is mobilizing, many people. And I'm interested in like, what are the kind of secondary effects of that in the state? Also, I'm very interested in how can that then be accessed by people who are not like making a job change and or having the ability to take a sabbatical and do a year or 2 years or however many months that you would be doing in the Corps. What would it be like to have a community of participation that then would yield, information systems, would yield better knowledge of your communities so that you have better support in the face of disasters. All of these things start to swim together, and then it adds to what Malo's saying in terms of mental health and health equity. So if either of you want to talk about that for a moment, I'd be really interested.
Angela, I think that's a great point you're making. And so, even though I'm a professor of urban planning and we train our students to think about the government role and planning agencies, planning actually happens everywhere, right? And I think that's what you're getting at and the work that Kif is doing as well, is sort of residents really have this local knowledge and they are able to determine some of the things that are best for them and what they want to see in their own communities. And I think it's people, like myself, who may have certain expertise, whether it be GIS mapping or doing different types of regression analysis, to help and to partner, but not to just drop in. And right. And so, and in my own profession, I see the challenge and limitations of us being very open to engaging all types of residents in the process, right? We have a planning meeting at 7 p.m. on a Thursday or Wednesday. Like, how many people can show up for that, right? When you're working 2 or 3 jobs or you're busy doing other things. And so we need to think about the role of technology to incorporate more people into the process. We need to think about changing our overall processes so that we can engage across many different ways. And I think you're getting at some of these important things, especially as you were talking about data and the use of data and being able to collect data. And so I think all of this is incredibly important. And I'll end this piece by just saying, in my work in Chile, what I found is after, one of the largest wildfires in modern day history in January 2017, and essentially wiped out an entire city in 20, or town, I should say, not a city, a town, in 24 hours. And the people who are doing all the organizing were primarily women, right? And what they said is, no, the officials are not going to come from Santiago and be very top down and tell us what to do. Instead, we know what's best for our community. We want schools, we want a childcare center, we want a health center, we want a fire department. And so they really engaged in a way to make the community much more responsive to the local needs, and also trying to incorporate many of the things you just outlined.
So I'm going to jump in again, because I think that the importance and the power of having some sort of information collection before a disaster happens is that there's something that we can understand to return to. There's a collective intelligence or a registry of what's been going on in a system before the system is greatly affected by any kind of change. And I think that we've had this for centuries. We've had griots, we've had the poets and that sing out poetry, right? But I think that to the core, but I think that data can do that too. And collecting information doesn't have to just be data, but recognizing what communities hold in terms of information about themselves is really important. And kind of it's fascinating to me to be able to recognize where some kind of information, what it might look like. It can take very many different forms. Yeah, it's just like, how do you plug people into participating and give them the value that participating can give?
Yeah,
I'll jump on that one.
I was just gonna have a question. And Kif, as you pick up on that, one of the things I also, if I could piggyback on Angela, is you talked about scale. And so if you could also touch on scale, I thought that was a really great point you touched on earlier, sort of how do you get
a couple things jump into mind there, Angela, that I think we're trying out here in California more maybe than elsewhere. One, there's an increasing recognition of the capacity gaps at the local level, that this is sometimes very technical work and the sort of a base to engage when it also, that connects to funding. So City of San Francisco has a dedicated team of staff members who can apply for every climate grant, and they know how to do all the numbers. They've got the tools, they've got the bells and whistles. Visalia, not so much. And so there's a competitive disadvantage for the most needy communities in many cases. So California has recognized that gap. They're starting to try and bridge that by putting more money into capacity building, right? Like, let's actually provide more ability to help people write grants, develop proposals, build that capacity. But they also recognize that that very concept is a little bit loaded and top down. And so there's a new initiative, this PACE program that just launched. It stands for Partners Advancing Climate Equity, where they said, look, we know that some of these CBOs on the front lines, these environmental justice organizations, they know exactly what they need in raw terms, but they don't know how to interface with housing and community development, or they don't have greenhouse gas reduction technology sort of skill base. So we're going to meet them in the middle. We're going to bring some climate experts together, but we are going to center their community knowledge as a core asset in this curriculum and this partnership, treat them like collaborators, and see where we get to. And I find it a really rich model. Another example I'll point to really quickly is the city of Oakland, which has done some incredible work to center equity in their climate work. they've also, as they were headed into their next climate action plan update, they recognize, one, cities are terrible at community outreach and community engagement, right? They never have enough money, but they also tend to want to bundle their contracts and have like, okay, I hire a contractor to do my climate action plan, and it's going to go to the AECOMs and the big firms that have those capacities to do big planning documents, who then bolt in a little community engagement on the side. So what the city of Oakland did was said, nuh-uh, no more. We're going to actually break those up into two contracts. There's the technical contract and the community engagement contract. And in the community engagement contract, we're going to put points into the evaluation for local firms, because they know that that community engagement is going to be richer when they actually, the people leading the community engagement actually are from and within Oakland. And that was a really novel approach that I thought also tried to flip the script on who's speaking for who about what, and what ultimately the knowledge that gets baked into these plans, which can last for many years, will yield.
When did that go into effect?
Oh boy, it was a couple of years ago. I was talking to the sustainability coordinator there. So I think it's been underway for a while. I don't know how many people have replicated it. I really just love that story, because I love that they recognize that differentiation and the need to separate and empower and fund people to do different roles that have different originations.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that the imbalance that you said happens between big cities and, you know, more powerful, even if it's a more powerful community group or a more powerful community, and a lesser funded or lesser access community. So I'm gonna think about that, because I think that a lot of the work that I'm doing is not it sits next to, but is not a government sponsored piece of work. And so I think that there's value in that self-creation, but then it's interesting to see when especially government, but not always government, but when there's value given to things that are already happening, rather than creating something with the intention of creating good in a space that is not the planner's the planner space. So I don't know, Malo, if that is something that you're specifically looking at. I'm really interested in what that might look like at UVA as well.
Sort of incorporating, say, incorporating sort of.
So like looking at things that are happening within communities first, rather than prioritizing planning that happens for communities, and asking communities to become like stakeholders instead of being the generators of the movement.
Right, there needs to be more of that. I'd be honest with you, it's not happening at the sort of the rate it should be happening at, but there are cities, and certainly even those that have the technical contracts or the contracts to do the work on the city's behalf that Kif was describing, to do the engagement. They're being much more intentional about the work. But I do think that we are thinking about the different processes that go into planning, right? And sort of how do you incorporate, and not just from planning side, but also from urban design, architecture, health, engineering. How do we open this up a lot more to be able to really address some of these local needs in a way that, you know, if you're looking at the entire city, sure, there are certain issues, but oftentimes those affluent communities get their issues up on the agenda, where the same communities that have been marginalized or, you know, vulnerable populations have not been able to get the basic needs met. And so there has been a shift that's taking place within some cities to say, look, let's think about this in a different way. And then I was also looking at some of the comments, and I'm sure when the question and answer comes up, but I thought Ms. Jones, I think it's Alethea Jones, has a question about, you know, how do you incorporate this into the broader process? And I think she was referring to Kif and maybe some of the earlier stuff we had said. And I think that's a fundamental question, right? Is that it's one thing to engage, but it's a whole nother than to take those comments, to take those requests, and allow residents to have equal power in terms of making sure that those changes do occur. And let's be honest, when we're talking about cities, we're talking about budgets. And so how do you then prioritize the way the tax dollars are spent or just the overall revenue spent within a city to address some of these issues. So, it really is all about implementation at the end of the day, which I know we have all been working on, but that's something I think is an excellent point that was raised as well. And your question, Angela, is a very good one.
Yeah, and I'll extend on that because I literally was starting to type a response to
Yes,
Lisa.
yes.
That's a
Good.
fundamental.
Yeah, it's good. It was good.
And it is, some people are doing it better, some people are doing it worse. I went to an amazing sort of racial equity in local government workshop put on by Movement Strategy Center, which I strongly recommend folks take a look at, or the Government Alliance in Race and Equity is also doing really incredible work. And they had a whole spectrum of community engagement, from your traditional kind of very basic information going one way to really a complete inversion of the ownership of local government by citizens. And I mean, it was a pretty radical socialist endpoint, which you could discuss and debate at length, but they definitely saw a spectrum there, with the goal being that you don't start with the question you want answered and then going to the community. You let the community
Right.
as a group define their priorities, goals, their vision,
Yeah.
and then you let government respond to it. I do think one of the things we're seeing to a degree, but it can definitely happen more, is back to what Malo said about budgets. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what your climate action plan says. If your finance people don't integrate climate risk into their capital planning and their other budget processes, it's sort of dead in the water. It's just lip service. But where you see cities who are actually starting to factor climate into their decision making, and climate with both a community lens, well, then suddenly it becomes business as usual. And then those questions get asked up front. Then those questions get asked earlier on, because it happens in a more a driven way. And it's not the only tool, but it's a really critical one, because what ends up happening otherwise is all those awesome sustainability coordinators and kind of good-hearted people like us who try and lift it up, it goes to council, and the budget people go like, yeah, but it's not in our indicators of performance, and things can stall out. So I really think that's a critical element, as well as really revisiting and reimagining what community engagement and community-centered engagement looks like.
But I think that also speaks to your, Malo, to your question about scale a little bit. I mean, maybe that's not the angle that you were coming in on, but when I think of scale and I think of community-derived data, a lot of times it's filling in holes that you just cannot get at. You can't get at the granularity through a government program or through academic research that communities can generate about themselves, because they have that base knowledge. And then Kif, as you're talking about it, it's in this example that you just gave of really kind of grassroots being grown, and communities asking the questions of government and government responding. That's very interesting, because it's kind of like, where are the levers of change that then people can directly plug into and have an effect? Is it at the neighborhood level? Is it at the city level? Is it at the regional level, state level, federal level? And how quickly can we get them in and have direct importance in all of those levels, or in the ones that actually matter most to them?
Yeah. Well, let me jump in. I think that's a great question. I would say it's all of the above. I was invited to the UN meeting by the Secretary General's office to talk about climate change just a couple of years ago. And, when you have all the scientists around the world that are talking about, we're doomed, here's the big issues. And they said there's 4 things that we really need to do immediately. Obviously, change our production system. Think about how do we become more energy efficient. But 2 things Angela just touched on was regional planning. And as much as we love New York and San Francisco, Los Angeles, London, Mumbai, all the great cities of the world, it's really those small to medium-sized cities that are going to make a difference. And so they said, in addition to this regional planning, it's the local planning, right? And so it really does get down to what you just talked about. So it is at the neighborhood level, it is at the community level, it is at the city level, regional level, to really try to have the kind of impact and move the needle, which we're talking about today around climate change and really focusing on climate resilience. So yeah, unfortunately, it's going to take all of us. I mean, that's a good thing, but it's going to take all of us in this process.
Yeah, I mean,
No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, for me, one thing that I find interesting, that we're kind of circling around, and maybe we're coming to an agreement on, I don't know, but it it's that maybe the huge programs that are the like all hands on deck, we've all got to figure out climate, that are on these kind of huge international
Mm,
levels, that the power is actually going to come from local community action, and how it's interpreted and played out on a kind of a person to person and interpersonal and intercommunity way. And I think that then you get the groundswell that actually makes the big difference. So you
Yeah,
can have these large projects, but not necessarily, but it's the local community level that might be most effective.
yeah, I think they sort of feed each other if I can. So one of the things we talked about when we were preparing for this call was like decision support, right? These are complex issues, right? It's really hard at a city level. I'll pick because I know some people in that space. If you're not a climate planner, you haven't done a greenhouse gas inventory to pick that up and run with it. And so the state or the federal government's role in helping to turn complex geospatial information into an actionable decision support tool for local governments, because they don't really care about like the 15 climate models. They care about the impacts in their community and how do they turn that into local zoning and planning. And this is just one example. So having the state play that proper role in provisioning that decision support, but letting the decision support decision making happen locally, and that could be at the community individual level through sort of empowered actions or local government or regional government, is really important. I think you can't do it like local governments and community members are just like, this is a very large, high information, high science issue that to make good decisions about, you need some help on a technical basis. The other thing I'll say on sort of the upside of that is like, personally, I don't know how many people have watched the kind of climate emergency mobilization conversation sort of percolating out. As somebody who works with a lot of local government planners, was like, oh, these are just like these resolution statements. I was kind of like rolling my eyes at them as mayors were getting excited about them, but they've really driven some change. They've boiled up from city after city after city to now some states to, provinces. And it's a powerful tool that has been kind of really coming up from the activist side through local governments and then to get to scale. So I've got to recognize the power happening in both directions.
well, this is, I mean, we could talk about all this all night, right? So I don't know if any of the attendees have questions, but this has been, we can keep it going, but I just,
Yeah, love to hear from our audience.
yeah. Or talk about the things they're doing. So. I didn't mean to stop the conversation. I was just,
Yeah, I think we just
it's a great
we're
conversation.
waiting for people to pull in their questions, huh?
I'll just say for Alvin, who commented on our use of acronyms, I want to apologize. Bad habits. If there's any that jumped out to you, I could try and resurrect what it actually stands for if I used them.
I'm also interested in how people that are attending, if they are personally involved in any kinds of community efforts or data collection efforts or environmental and like direct environmental work within their communities, how they've experienced that. So if you have something to say around that, that would be interesting for us to feed into this conversation.
Absolutely.
In the meantime,
Yeah. So if we're to think about from our perspective work, right, sort of what are those big challenges or barriers that we need to break down to kind of get to that next level of this work? I'll start. I mean, I was just curious listening to you because I think that there's a lot of promise, obviously, but there's still these challenges. But for me, it's really about planning and government agencies changing the way that we engage with local residents and getting that feedback, but more than just listening, but really allowing residents to prioritize what's important and then to try to really implement that, right? And use the kind of training that we have to bring those two things together where we can meet in the middle to try to really bring about the change that we need to see. And that's not easy to do. And I know some of the panel, some of the attendees had brought that up. So.
We have a question about electric car infrastructure in the country. That's not something that I have any information on, but do either of you?
Well, I have some. So Princeton University just put out a big report on what we need to do to become have net zero emissions by 2050. And in there, they talk about us needing to have about, I guess, I forgot the exact number of millions of electric vehicles, but the electrification of vehicles is incredibly important. And we need to build an infrastructure around that, right? So we know companies like Tesla and other companies are trying to do that, but at the same time, there's also issues with getting enough materials to build the batteries, and battery technology is constantly changing and improving. And so then what happens to the older batteries? So, but there's a big discussion about how do we, electrify buses, our everyday vehicles and things like that. That's incredibly important. And I'll try to find that study and post it in the chat for you. But I don't know if Kev.
One of the things that I think is interesting about electric vehicles is that it really cuts down on transmissions in communities of color and poor communities, because that's where freeways go through. Oftentimes, that's a lot of communities, especially Black communities, have been cut in and sectioned off from other parts of the more prosperous cities through freeways. So by electrifying vehicles, then you're reducing, you're having a direct impact in your communities by not having that exhaust go into poor neighborhoods, but also into your own neighborhood. So it's like you get the direct result of the cleaner air that your vehicle affords. Now there's the whole other thing about should I buy a new car, and the embedded energy and costs for a new vehicle. I'm not really sure about that answer. It's something that I'm thinking about right now, but I do think a lot about how poor communities experience a much greater exposure to poor air quality that they don't produce themselves, that actually wealthier neighbors actually produce. So that's something that's interesting in the electric vehicle conversation.
I'll add a couple of thoughts, and again, not an expert by any means, just some lay observations, if you will. One thing on the sort of equity front, which is interesting, and it's somewhat related to electric vehicles. I think we're further off from autonomous vehicles than maybe we thought a year or so ago, and it seemed like we were getting close. But I find this fascinating idea of autonomous vehicles helping to undermine the pretextual traffic stop, which is a huge tool for policing and racial discrimination. And I'm imagining this day when cops can't stop autonomous vehicles being this really great watershed moment, but we may be further away from that. I also think there's some perverse impacts of electric cars in that, one, they are more new cars, and that tends to go to certain community demographics. Drivership in some communities is much lower already, urban, poor, lower income communities, which tend to be communities of color. And so if that is seen as sort of the be all and end all of dealing with transportation infrastructure, we've lost a lot of opportunity for people who walk and take public transit. And we're going to see decreasing investment in public transit at a time when actually electrification of public transit would be a great win. And so I'm a little worried there about electric vehicles feeling like, I did my part, I got my Tesla, right? That's sort of the classic, individual behavior change. So we need to make sure we're coupling any electric vehicle infrastructure investment with corresponding public transportation investments and incentives to help poor, low-income people get access to electric vehicles, if that's the way we're going.
So once again, Elizabeth is asking a question about electric vehicles being appealing to people who may need it most. And to your point, Kif, I think it's not about necessarily single family vehicle ownership, that really it's about making sure that transportation is safe and available to every single person within a community. And that, we miss a lot when we step off the subway platform and then we no longer interact with those people day to day. We miss a lot when we don't walk to the bus stop, and that when we get in our cars and it's just us and our, you know, karaoke time, that's great. But I do feel like there's that if we do build on public transportation, make it really comfortable and very efficient, that that's a way to also increase community interaction.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's going to take multi modes of transportation, right, to get there, especially we're thinking about climate change and our emissions. But you're absolutely right, Angela, sort of dealing with the infrastructure we have and building that up, as opposed to just thinking about more vehicles on the road, which we know at the end of the day, that just leads to more construction of our roads and highways and things like that, which at the end of the day takes up more land. And so lots of challenges.
I'm seeing a question here, if we'll pivot away from electric vehicles, about kind of getting involved. A question, suggestions for environmental activists, not getting support from government agencies here in LA, and another question about what the average citizen can do to support the climate. So I would say I work for a state agency, so I'm not going to say go out and hit the streets, but it's out there. It's a tool. Getting involved, mobilizing is important. As I mentioned, the climate emergency declarations have made a difference. I actually think there's a ton of stuff to do in LA. I think that there are a lot of environmental organizations. I can just say, this is shameless self-promotion, but we have now a climate volunteer hub on our website. We're trying to aggregate climate volunteer opportunities. So if you're looking for something to do, hopefully we can help point you to something. I think there's organizations like Tree People and City Plants. If you're into urban greening, there's Food Cycle and everybody else. The city actually has some pretty aggressive climate action goals. I have to give some props to Mayor Garcetti for some of the work that they're doing. I don't know whether the activists get the support, but there is a lot of climate action activity. And in terms of what you can do, start with a carbon footprint, right? Like there's so many calculators out there, figure out where your big emissions are. It's probably going to be travel if you're an affluent individual. It's probably, if you do air travel, that's usually a big one. Your food choices. Look at the Project Drawdown has a great list of big macro steps you can take, but any of these things are going to turn into, what are your energy choices? Can you get on a renewable energy choice program from your utility? What are your food choices? And what are your transportation choices? Those are the big three. How can you decarbonize your building, your home? Can you electrify your home? Those are steps you can take. And there's a bunch of, depends on what state you're in and the incentives and everything else, but those are my top list of things you can do.
I think also there's a lot of kind of deer in the headlights and mobilizing that happens when we think of the climate emergency as being overwhelming or just not something that you individually can address. And Kif, I think you're absolutely right. You individually can address it, especially through food choices and transportation choices, but through a lot of different ways. But what I was getting at, and I just put Zooniverse in there, it's an organization, it's a platform that links people to different citizen science type of work. And really it's about kind of finding anything that you're interested in, anything that you're passionate about, and just experimenting with it. And it doesn't matter, you don't have to commit your life to it. You can just, dip in and dip out. And of course, if you find something that you're passionate about and you really want to go deep in it, that will help. But, I think that it's all about kind of integrating it into your whole self and making sure that there's a way for you to participate in a better climate or a better environment. Whether that better environment is a social environment or like the air that we breathe and where we swim and how everything else, the food that we eat. So I think that just any part of that is interesting to you, experiment with it, learn about it, see who else is doing that work.
Yeah, and I agree with what you all have said, and I would just add, I do some work. We haven't talked a lot about the private sector, but they play a major role in this. And I do a lot of work with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, based in the UK, and they have a whole initiative around the circular economy, circular cities, but they work with some of the largest companies in the world. So they have the Circular Economy 100, with people like Google, Nike, and so forth. And it really is consumers that are putting the kind of pressure. Not to say they don't have leaders at those organizations, but it's the consumers who are saying, this is what we want. We need to do things differently. And it's really trying to force some of that change. And I've seen that directly through my work around food systems, is that as school districts start to say, we want locally sourced food. So there's an initiative in California, California Food for California Kids. And you get some of the largest conventional food producers to now say, well, we're talking about, hundreds of millions of dollars from California. And so we've got to start changing the way we produce food. It's not just this freeze dried and then delivered. So a perfect example, Oakland Unified School District, back on Earth Day several years ago, they wanted to just do a simple study. Where does their asparagus come from? Turns out it was grown in South America, flown to China for packaging, and then sent to the Bay Area, some 17,000 miles. So getting to your point, Kif, about our when you travel, it's kind of our climate footprint. And we grow, and they were saying we grow asparagus right here in California. So a big push to have locally grown food within the school system. And so just those things there, parents saying this is what we want, can start to lead to a bigger change. And so now you have other states like Virginia and New York and Minnesota all trying to do very similar things that California has done.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was brushing up on your bios before this call, and I saw that piece of work you did with the Oakland Unified School District and their farm to sort of fork to food.
Yeah.
Really, really cool. I wanted to also mention something kind of in the vein of what Angela was just saying about find things you're passionate about. Like, don't stress it either, right? Like, nobody can be a perfect climate, citizen. You're going to make some consumer choices. You're going to pick some things, not do some things. It's the net impact and your participation at any level that's going to be beneficial. I get people who are calling me, should I do this? Should I buy that? Should I wear this? Should I stop wearing that? Right? And you can get really wrapped around the axle about trying to have a perfect accounting of all your impacts and burdens, and you're never going to get there, especially in a first world country. So do what you can, where you can, try not to get stressed out. And just be part of it and try and do it in a community facing way, so you get that secondary impact for well-being, for community building and other things. I got a question up above, maybe for you, Malo. The one about pandemic.
Yes.
Is that one you got a
Yeah,
thought on? Oh, it's now down at the bottom too.
Yeah, so certainly, I mentioned the pandemic, and I think the question is, what other things have I seen that people are thinking about, sort of the long changing impacts of the environment? I mean, the most direct one, honestly, has been around food and around the heat island effects within cities. So depending on the communities I'm working in, so if I'm doing work in South America, I mean, we're talking about multi-generations of farmers that say they know that it's changing because they see climate's changing, because they can see it in the food that they're growing. If you're in a place like New York City, for example, people talk about, just actually measuring the temperature off the concrete, measuring the temperature within the city on really hot days, and you can see that the temperatures are rising, right? You don't have to just go to Phoenix for that. You can see it everywhere. So those are direct things that people are seeing, and there's a need to obviously grow more trees, to think about increasing our natural land, enhancing our natural landscapes and things like that. So there's a lot being done in those areas. So the pandemic just really highlighted all those things. And let me give you an example. Certainly we know the impact it's had on New York. People were sheltered in place in these very tiny apartments. And then, if not everyone can just go to Central Park, and then you start thinking about in your community, where can you go even to just take a phone call? Where can you go to get, I think Kefi had brought up mental health earlier, just to have some space to yourself. And it became very apparent to people there's not a lot of, even though New York does a fairly good job compared to large cities, it's still not enough open space for everyone to just have their little piece to be safe and get their, meditate, whatever they need to do. And so that's another direct thing that we've all seen, is that we've got to think about that. Plus just the airflow of buildings, the quality of buildings, air pollution, the role that plays. So all of these things, people are quite aware. They're quite connected to the environment right now. I think it's a window of opportunity And some of it's been forced, obviously, given the kind of changes that we've seen, but it's a window of opportunity given what's just happened for us to really reflect on what kind of society we want to have. And some people, if you've been fortunate enough, have not been commuting, and they're starting to think about their quality of life. We know a lot of New Yorkers have moved out of New York City. A lot of people moved out of San Francisco, and they've gone to places like Boise, Idaho. They've gone to Georgia. They've gone to, South Carolina. They've gone to all other places, some of them very rural, and realizing that, hey, this may be a better quality of life for them and their families. So, I don't like to predict the future, but I certainly believe that this may lead to some changes in how people think about their everyday lives in relationship to the environment.
So Malo, I think that's really interesting because I've noticed it. I actually live pretty close to the beach. And
Mhm.
in San Francisco, what happened fairly quickly after the shelter in place orders came was that they also created slow streets. So they
Yes,
had streets that were bicycle only or pedestrian only, so
yes,
that there would be more room on the sidewalk, that you wouldn't have to kind of scurry past each other. I don't know exactly how it happened in every other city, but a lot of people ended up coming to the beach because it was the only place that they could be outside and be in a group with their family with enough social distancing. And I think that I would be interested to see how much more beach use that's going to carry over into next year. Like, what's it going to be like? Because now people are used to going outside in order to have that mental space. Before, I was seeing people go like into their car, sitting in their car, because if you're living in pretty close quarters with a lot of people, you go sit in your car to have a private phone call. Maybe that's still true in places where it's really cold outside, you need a little shelter while you're outside. But in places like San Francisco, you can definitely have a lot more interaction with the outdoors. What's that going to do for people's demands about their environment? How will people then have the opportunity or think about being more engaged in it? It's like, now that I've had this, I don't want to give it back. I want more
that's right.
outside.
Well, in New York,
100%.
we're talking about having open streets and being much more pedestrian friendly and bicycle friendly. And I know Los Angeles and Santiago, a lot of cities around the world have been doing this. But Kif, I'm sorry, I think you were going to say
Oh,
something.
I was just going to echo. I like that experience. I know Oakland did a big slow streets. They tried it out and then they were like, oh my God, we can do this quite a bit more. They're thinking about keeping many of these streets in place. I think there's some study they're doing about the viability of it. The ways that we pivoted our business districts and opened up parking spaces, which those had been called parklets and was a whole like urban design strategy. And now it's like, they just threw them out there. And that may be one of the most powerful lasting impacts of the pandemic is how quickly government and business were able to pivot into adapting to these things. So it's really hard now to put the genie back in the bottle and say, oh no, we can't make change quickly, because we just did it. And so the idea that somebody can come along and say, look, you've always had parking spaces this way. Nope, it doesn't have to be that way. That's an incredibly liberating and empowering tool for citizens to say, I do have agency to control my urban fabric and to ask for radical change. And that, I think, is really, we haven't even begun to see where all that could go.
That's right.
Well, one of the things that hampers that process is the application process, like how bureaucratic cities are, or how bureaucratic places are, states are. And I think that if especially if you have a lot of government bureaucracy, or a lot of, I've got to go to the counter to get a permit, and you can make that easier, you can make that faster. I know a friend of mine has a company that is looking to make government processes faster and more fluid, and it's been very, very interesting that during, it's called City Grows, and it's also a Columbia alum, Catherine Generakis. She might even be on she might be on this call. But City Grows is what they try to do is they try to help those processes move a lot faster, so that you can respond more nimbly to the need for parking, parklets, and open spaces.
Looks like we're coming to the end. I'll say, yeah, anything we can do and sort of see government as a more nimble partner in these things. I think there was a survey actually shortly before the pandemic about telework, and like businesses were like, no, it would take us 2-3 years to implement a telework strategy, and they did it in weeks, right? And many, with some mistakes made and some issues happening, but like government and private sector can move quickly when there's an urgent need. And so is climate the urgent need now? Are citizens saying enough is enough? And can that be one of the drivers to start taking some much more aggressive steps? Maybe we're at that moment. I hope we are.
I'm going to say yes, Kif, because that's a great way to end this.
It is positive.
It's a great way to participate too.
I planned that. Well, yeah, any closing just words? Angela, you want to give us a few words? We'll go around robin and say our last thoughts.
I think that we've come to agreement and resolution that we can move quickly if we want to, and that participation on all levels, but especially in your local community, is key. I'm really excited.
Yeah, I really
go forth.
That. Yeah, I really second what you said, Angela, and get engaged where you are, and we haven't talked a lot about young people. I know we all care about that, but also really starting to really engage young people. They have so much energy, and I see that every day as a professor. They're not jaded like me, and you get to a certain age and you just say, oh, I've seen it all. They have so much energy, so we can also take what you just said, Angela, and also just bring young people into the fold so they can get out there and help improve our society.
Agree, definitely agree on the young people, but also some of us slightly older codgers. Like we are of a generation, literally from us on up, where told you this story, like when I went to Columbia, there was no environmental studies. Now there's an Earth Institute. Now there's a climate school, right? Like institutions change, and you as an example of a faculty member, like your breadth of academic discipline, the humanity it covers along with the urban studies is like this incredible interdisciplinary space. When I was in grad school, they kind of were like, oh, hey, let's tell you how to do interdisciplinary work. And I was like, I don't know any other way to do it. It's the only way that I've worked. So we now are rising into positions of leadership ourselves. We are bringing up a second and a third and a fourth generation of people who have these considerations and awareness as part of their value set going into the workforce in the public and private sector. And so we have just this incredible body of people who already get the core message and vision, and now just need to be empowered to act. And that's terribly exciting for me to see who's out there, the kinds of work that can happen all the way up. So I'll just say thank you to Columbia for bringing us together on this it's the first alumni event I've ever done. So glad to have the opportunity, and really appreciate, Professor Hudson, your participation on your way out from the institution. Really, it's been wonderful to get to meet you. And Angela, it's been a pleasure to just come together around this.
Likewise, what a great group to be a part of. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone.